Found footage horror movies. Often people either love them or hate them, which makes a lot of sense since there's quite the gap in quality among some of the more famous found footage horror films that have come out since the turn of the century. As popular as found footage horror movies are today, with often at least one or more produced a year, this wasn't always the case. In fact, the boom in the making of this horror subgenre is quite a recent phenomenon, with a lot of the popularity of found footage stemming from the release of the 1999 film, The Blair Witch Project. The Blair Witch Project, which stunned audiences across the nation, even leading some viewers to come out of the theater believing what they saw was in fact real, was a feat that hasn't really been replicated since, and may never be replicated. Because found footage horror movies naturally lean on the technology available at the time, the age we currently live in makes it difficult to pull off the authenticity of the Blair Witch Project. Does this mean that the Blair Witch Project is the only good found footage film? No, definitely not. Because of the versatility of found footage horror movies, filmmakers can get creative and make extremely unique viewing experiences. Movies like Cloverfield, Paranormal Activity, and many others all manage to give audiences an immersive and somewhat realistic horror experience, each one in a different way than the other. Today, we'll explore the history of the found footage horror movie, how they became popular and how they've evolved, as well as what different elements make a good found footage film. Before we talk about the Blair Witch Project, or any of the other examples I listed earlier, I'd like to take a look at the history of the subgenre and point out a few predecessors. Although we can fairly confidently point out the first true found footage horror movie, I want to first move even further back than that. Before the subgenre existed, many movies still attempted to convince their audience that what they were seeing had an element of realness to it. This was done through a trope that still exists and is very common today. What I'm referring to is the based on real events trope, which can be traced back to around the 70s for horror films. Often a movie that uses this trope will simply show a line of text at the start of the film stating something like, "The events in this movie are real," sometimes being truthful, but most of the time, for horror movies anyway, being false. In her article on the found footage genre, Cecilia Sayad gives us a few early examples of this trope, saying, quote, "Horror films' claim about the veracity of the events depicted go beyond the found footage mode. The Last House on the Left, which was actually based on Ingmar Bergman's The Virgin Spring, simply lies about the real status of the story it tells, with opening credits that read, 'The events you are about to witness are true. Names and locations have been changed to protect those individuals still living.' The Texas Chainsaw Massacre may have been inspired by the acts of real-life serial killer Ed Gein, but the prologue's suggestion that the film's characters were based on real people is a hoax." End quote. Not all horror movies that use this trope are lying, though. For example, movies such as the Amityville Horror and the recent Conjuring series are somewhat based on real life. Although The Conjuring may sometimes be pushing it, the Warrens were real-life paranormal investigators. Explaining how the found footage subgenre goes a step further than these types of films, I'll again quote Cecilia Sayad, as she says, quote, "The found footage horror, however, goes beyond such claims of realness. The films are not presented to us as inspired by real events. They are supposed to constitute the audio-visual documentation of these events. What we see, we are told, are real people, not characters based on them." End quote. Alright, now that I've finished my tangent, let's go back to actual found footage horror films. To answer the question, what was the first found footage horror film, I point to the 1980 film Cannibal Holocaust, directed by Ruggero Deodato. Coming out almost a full 20 years before the Blair Witch Project, Deodato's Cannibal Holocaust is one of the most infamous and controversial films ever made. I won't go into much detail on the actual plot of the film, since it's very, very graphic. All I'll say is that my friends and I only made it about 15 minutes in before we had to turn it off. The movie presents itself as the actual record of a documentary crew headed to the Amazon rainforest to learn about an indigenous tribe known for their cannibalism. To quote Screen Rant's Andrew Hausman, "Cannibal Holocaust has more in common with 70s exploitation than it does modern found footage. But it did pave the way for the technique with its cheap, grimy aesthetic that disturbingly resembles a snuff film. Deodato also created a myth behind his film, making it seem as if the found footage might be real by convincing his actors to disappear from the public eye." End quote. The large reason for the infamy behind this film is because of the extent to which Deodato tried to present the movie as fact, as he was even arrested in Italy on suspicion of murder because of the film. Yeah, would not really recommend watching this one. After Cannibal Holocaust's release and subsequent ban in many countries, there were really no other found footage horror movies released in the 80s or the 90s. However, fast forward to the year 1999, where two film students from the University of Central Florida would finalize a movie that would forever go down as a cult classic and is considered the gold standard for the found footage genre. Of course, I'm talking about the Blair Witch Project. The film, with a budget of under $500,000, was a box office success, raking in almost $250 million. The reason for this overnight success was not only because of how good the movie was, but also because of how much of a cultural phenomenon it was. The Blair Witch Project actually succeeded at tricking its audience into believing it was real through the careful planning of the promotion and release of the film by its two directors, Daniel Myrick and Eduardo Sanchez. The two began working on the film many years prior to its release and based it on a fabricated legend. The film is set in Burkittsville, Maryland, which is actually a real place. Without giving too much away, the film follows three amateur filmmakers, played by actors who at the time were completely unknown, as they travel into the woods to investigate the legend of the Blair Witch. While classic shaky cam and fairly low-quality equipment enhance the realness of the film. However, to truly understand how this movie fooled audiences at the time, we have to look at its brilliant promotional scheme. Again quoting Screen Rant's Andrew Hausman, the film is perhaps most remembered for its elaborate marketing campaign, which included a website detailing a police investigation of the case and a missing persons poster. End quote. The era in which the movie came out helps it immensely, as the internet was still small enough to make it truly believable. In his article on the film and its relationship with the internet, J.P. Talati talks about the website that went along with the film, saying, quote, "Mark Grazer and Dade Hayes offer a partial explanation, noting that calmer heads are realizing that the Blair Witch site was not an added-on marketing tool, but was designed as part of the film experience, one that tapped into fans of the horror genre. Talati says, would go a bit further and suggest that the selling of the Blair Witch Project and the telling of that film, its narrative construction, were from the start a careful match or project." End quote. As a result of the success of the Blair Witch Project, found footage horror movies are now a common sight in theaters, as many are released each year. The success of the Blair Witch Project also tells us a lot about the close-knit relationship between when a found footage horror movie is released and the technology of the time. This can be seen in the movies that came after the Blair Witch Project, such as the Paranormal Activity series, as well as the Unfriended series, with the latter being completely set in a Skype call. And although some of the found footage films that have followed the Blair Witch Project have been quite underwhelming, there have been a good number of gems that have come out in the last 20 years or so. I can't even knock Unfriended too much, since it is a pretty unique concept, and this genre requires a lot of originality and creativity. It just definitely isn't my favorite horror film. But enough of that, let's take a look at what exactly is needed in order to create a well-made found footage horror movie. According to Devon Taylor from The Nightmare on Film Street, there are 5 elements that are necessary to craft a successful found footage film, listed as follows: authenticity, the application of fear, a sense of urgency, purpose, and style. In Taylor's article, he points out a few movies that really exemplify either one or all of these elements. Cloverfield, Paranormal Activity, Grave Encounters, and The Sacrament are the ones listed. I've actually yet to see these last two, but I would agree that Paranormal Activity and especially Cloverfield are some of the most noteworthy films in the subgenre. I agree with what Taylor has to say in this article, and would especially like to emphasize the importance of style in a found footage film. This is where found footage films differ from any other type of horror movie. The way in which we are shown these supposedly real events is, in my opinion, the real selling point of this subgenre, and is the area in which filmmakers get to be most creative. To take a closer look at this, I'd like to focus on a few of my favorite found footage films and examine how they are presented. First, Mark Duplass and Patrick Brice's 2014 film Creep, as well as its 2017 sequel. Personally, I'm a bigger fan of the original, but I think both movies are great and really bring out the strengths of found footage film. Both movies incorporate the style of a live recording, as both center around the documentation of this guy, the creep. The narrative of these movies is extremely interesting and unique, and they will definitely leave you a little uneasy. I don't want to spoil anything, but I would recommend checking out at least the first one, since it's one of my personal favorite found footage films. Moving on, I'd like to give one last example of a different style of found footage films, the mockumentary. This style is perhaps my favorite, with the 2008 film Lake Mungo being a prime example of the effectiveness of this style. I won't focus on Lake Mungo right now, though not to say I don't enjoy it, rather there being one that I think is even better. The film I'd like to dive into now is one of my favorite horror movies of all time, and in my opinion is even better than the Blair Witch Project. The film I'm talking about is Koji Shiraishi's 2005 cult classic, Noroi the Curse. I'm a sucker for J-horror, and even though the movie is a little hard to track down in the US, it's definitely worth the watch. The movie begins by telling us that the film we're about to watch is the final documentary created by the presumed dead paranormal filmmaker Masafumi Kobayashi, completed right before his mysterious disappearance. GQ's Scott Meslow describes perfectly the strengths of this film, saying, quote, Noroi is introduced as a mostly completed documentary crafted by a seasoned journalist. Because the character holding the camera is supposed to be a professional cameraman, Noroi largely avoids the headache-inducing shaky cam popularized by legions of Blair Witch Project imitators, end quote. He also goes on to say that, quote, because Kobayashi is experienced, the found footage is edited more like a conventional documentary meant to entertain and inform a mass audience, which means that Noroi, even at nearly 2 hours, is paced more like a real film than some weirdo's old home movie, end quote. Noroi perfectly captures the realistic feeling that is key to found footage, while managing to maintain a downright disturbing atmosphere throughout the film. The moving plot that introduces many different side stories and paranormal occurrences all converge to create one of the scariest endings to a movie I've ever seen. I remember when I first watched it, my friend and I streamed it online and began the movie at 1 a.m. Around halfway through, we decided to turn it off, but after about 10 minutes of sitting in my bed, we texted each other and agreed that we had to see how the hell this thing was going to end. When we finally finished it, I didn't even want to walk the 20 steps to my bathroom and would rather stay in the safety of my bed. I can't recommend this movie enough, and I think it really hits all the elements required for a found footage film. To wrap things up, will there ever be another found footage film like the Blair Witch Project? Probably not, but that just means for now we can enjoy it along with the hidden gems and speculate on what's to come. Perhaps in the future we'll see something equally as unique that takes advantage of the technology available at the time. I truly believe that found footage is one of the most exciting horror genres and truly one of the most unique. For now, horror fans like myself can enjoy some of these amazing found footage films that really blur the lines between fiction and reality and keep me on the edge of my seat. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you've enjoyed this dive into the world of found footage horror.